Joining us now by phone, we have Josh, aka Edinger Mentum. Great to have you, sir.
Yeah, it's great to be on.
Yeah, of course. So I just built you up a little bit. We can throw this up on the screen. 8-8, guys. 8-8. Oh, well, we'll get to this in a second. But the very last element of this block is just to give you some cred. You called 2022 right. You said, hey, I don't think this looks like a red wave. You also called the Warnock race correctly. You've since started a Substack where you've been delving into how you're looking at all of these races. But you've been saying, hey, it's possible that actually this time, unlike 2016 and 2020, the polls could be systematically underestimating Democrats, which is what happened in 2022. Now, I laid out for everybody, like, you're a partisan, you want Kamala to win, et cetera, so people can factor that in as they will. But what is your analysis of why you think the polls could be looking more like a 2022 midterm miss that underestimated the Democrats versus the last times that Trump was on the ballot?
Yeah, well, this chart that you're seeing up here, this actually isn't mine. This is by my friend Josh Taft, who created this model. I just highlighted for him yesterday, but it does illustrate something that I think is an important consideration here. So the way this model works, you can see its past track record and its current projection is that it's partially based on polling, but it also adjusts that to factor in things like pre-election indicators from actual voters, specifically special elections and primaries. And what we've seen from this model is that has been relatively pretty predictive of whether or not the polls are massively off. This model, if when applied to the data we had in 2020, would have correctly indicated that there was something wrong with the polling, that pre-election indicators like primaries and special elections weren't picking up, that the polls that showed Biden up by 8 or 7 points were probably off, and it would have been correct then. It also would have been correct in 2012 in saying that the very tied polls they saw then that underestimated Democrats were not factoring in how voters were voting on the ground through that year. And what that model says now is that there's currently no indication that from how voters have been voting in primary elections like the Washington primary, which is historically predictive, and in special elections, that the polling we've seen with a slight Kamala national lead is off in the way that it was in 2020. If anything, it probably may be underestimating her by a point or a point and a half. So that's just one sign that these kind of canaries in the coal mine for major pro-democratic polling errors, at least at a national level, are not showing up right now.
Got it. So Josh, you wrote a piece for your Substack specifically about all of the signs. Could you lay out beyond the model what some of the other things that people can look at for the case for underestimating Democrats?
Yeah, of course. So I think Krystal mentioned that this, and I said in the tagline of the article that it would be something of a 2022 redux. And the thing to look at there isn't national polling, which was actually pretty accurate in 2022. It was state polling where the argument here from some people, some very, very pro-democratic people who essentially say the party can do no wrong, is that this was because there was a flood of red wave Republican pollsters who were just showing the party up no matter what, and the aggregators were too credulous to keep them out of their model. Some of these were run by these firms were run by actual high schoolers, and they just included them, and they always showed Republicans ahead, and they were wrong. And that happened to a degree. But the larger thing that happened that year is that you had nonpartisan pollsters with no connection to Republicans, often responding to the narratives put out by the right, and in some cases showing massive swings to the right at the end of the race in response to what seems to have been just narratives and not what was actually going on the ground. You had in Washington the polls prior to October that year were showing the race largely what it turned out to be. The Democrat there running for Senate won by about 15 points. But after Republican pollsters started showing a tied race and there was some chatter about it being a sleeper flip, the nonpartisan pollsters followed their lead. They didn't find leads as close as what the Republican pollsters found, but they showed a pretty significant shift to the right, and one that didn't happen. In reality, there was no movement from the primary that year to the general election. The Democrats won by 15 points both times. And this gets into a larger point that I think Nate Cohn in the New York Times kind of proved to an extent when he talked about how pollsters have changed, is that pollsters are terrified of getting a miss like 2020 again. They don't think that's something they can afford at all reputationally. Cohn even said it has mental health like problems for them where they get really upset if they miss it that badly.
Wow.
And they are pulling out all the stops in a lot of ways, in some ways that are reminiscent of past times when they've gotten too in their heads about a polling miss in a way that could end up getting them on the wrong side of things on the opposite way.
Yeah, I think to me, one of the most compelling data points in this direction is what you just laid out, which is that we know that pollsters have actually changed their methodology because they're so fearful. And they've effectively, used this methodology of asking people to self-recall how they voted, which has in the past led to less accurate results, consistently less accurate results. But their theory is, listen, there could be this group of infrequent, less sort of politically engaged voters that tend to go for Donald Trump that we just cannot get in touch with. We just cannot reflect them accurately within our polls. They attribute that, potentially that was the 2016 miss, potentially that was again the 2020 miss. And that's a plausible theoretical possibility. And so they're basically saying, we're just gonna use this method to juice Trump's numbers to try to jerry-rig some way to account for this this infrequent voter that we just cannot reach and cannot model. The other possibility, and this was also laid out by Nate Cohn, is that in 2016, the miss was because pollsters weren't weighting by education, like college education versus non-college. Okay, they fixed that in 2020. They have an even bigger miss. The other theory is that 2020 was obviously during the pandemic, and you had a partisan difference in the way people responded to the pandemic. So you had a lot of liberal, white-collar professionals at home dying to tell pollsters how excited they were to vote for Democrats, and that one-off phenomenon is what led to the miss in 2020. So if that's the explanation, then this attempt by pollsters to sort of artificially juice Trump's numbers may be, correcting for something that doesn't need correcting, since the pandemic was such a unique time period and had this, unique partisan difference in terms of how people responded to it. You dug into the evidence for each of these possibilities, the just infrequent voter that you just can't model and is more overwhelmingly pro-Trump than pro-Democrat, versus the different pandemic response bias. What evidence did you find in favor or opposed to each of these theories?
Yeah, well, I think it's basically what you said, where there's the grand unified theory, as Cohn calls it, which is that there's just something about Trump voters, they're just impossible to contact, they're too low social trust, you'll never be able to reach them through traditional methods, and you have to find some way to represent them when you're polling. And I get that idea in theory. I think in a sense it is kind of like a blue state understanding that kind of exoticizes Trump voters to a degree. I live in a purple state, Georgia. Trust me when I say that Trump voters are not very quiet about who they support, especially not now.
Yeah.
It's not something they're particularly ashamed of in the way they might have been 8 years ago. And he calls it the patchwork theory, which I think does it a bit of a disservice, but that's more compelling to me because it makes sense. We know that pollsters in 2016 did not whip by education. We know that made up for most of the misses that they made. We know in 2020 there was a major non-response bias in favor of Democrats, something we're not necessarily seeing now. One of the most interesting data points, and I wish they did follow up on this because it could be a huge deal, was a chart by people from the Polarization Research Study looking at partisan response rates to YouGov polls, and they found that since about the beginning of this year, the rate of Democrats responding to their polls has gone down, and the rate of Republicans responding has gone up to the extent that they've had to actually weight Democratic respondents higher than Republican respondents. So this phenomenon, to the extent that it might have happened before, we may not have any proof that it's happening now. And we know that YouGov has they've shown that they've made changes to account for this kind of inverse phenomenon, this opposite of what you'd expect. But we don't know that other pollsters who may not even be as aware of this are still trying to hedge on the side of caution and react to what happened in 2020 if they're doing that properly. So quite ironically, and you can say whatever the reason for this might be, I think probably the funniest one is that liberals got so angry at the mainstream media after the Biden dropout saga, where they thought that they were trying to end his presidency, that they stopped responding to pollsters. But like this. That's what I think should be the ending of this election because that's very fun to me.
Yeah,
like
that would be genuinely hilarious.
Yeah. It's like they got so pissed at Ezra Klein they stopped picking up the phone.
Right.
That would be incredible.
I do have a question for you, Josh, because you're in Georgia. I'm assuming, beyond polling, you've been looking at early voting. Are there any trends there that could pick up on your thesis and bear that out?
Yeah, well, the early voting here is a really tough one to take too much stock in. Georgia does not have party registration. You can't track it by like what the partisanship like you can in Nevada. They do have for whatever reason, this is probably for not very great reasons, they do track voters by race here, which can be an interesting heuristic for how the parties are doing because in Georgia, non-whites vote Democratic and white voters vote Republican, and elections here can often be just turnout battles more than they are persuasion battles, although that's been different in recent years where the suburbs have really become big battlegrounds in the way that they weren't before. And we've been seeing the black vote here is about in line with what it was in 2020 among habitual early voters. So among the same population that voted early in 2020, it's about the same. The difference is that there are a lot of Republicans who voted on election day in 2020, a lot of white votes who are like, I think that of the voters who voted on election day in 2020 and are voting early now, they're like 72, 75% Republican. So we have a slightly whiter voting like pool right now in Georgia than we've had it like maybe in a couple cycles. But a lot of that is because we have a more depolarized early voting electorate than we have before. There are a lot of Republicans who vote on election day and who are voting now. There are probably some Democrats who voted early in 2020 because they didn't want to get COVID through mail who are going to vote on election day. And I would say generally you're probably going to get about 26, 27% black turnout, like with the way things are going here in Georgia, which isn't like ideal for Democrats, but like it's winnable. I think Warnock won was able to go to a runoff with similar demographics in 2022.
Gotcha.
Very interesting.
I've seen some theories about a shy Kamala voter this time, and some Democratic groups seem to be buying into this idea. I'm thinking most specifically of this ad that went viral of like women secretly bucking their husband's will and voting for Kamala Harris, and these, stickers that are popping up in women's restrooms that are like, your vote's secret, don't worry, you can vote for Kamala and not feel bad about it. So clearly some parts of the Democratic coalition believe that this could be a thing of like Nikki Haley voters who are in Republican households or their husbands are Republicans who are secretly going to go and cast their ballot for Kamala Harris and may not be telling pollsters the truth about the way that they're voting, or the inverse of the quote-unquote shy Trump voter theory back in 2016. Do you see any indications that that could be the case?
I don't know. I've heard people say that actually for a while. I remember people saying it in like 2016 about Hillary, and it didn't end up being true.
Yeah.
It's it makes sense in theory, but like, I mean,
there's not really evidence for it.
Yeah. It's kind of a bit of a fan fiction, I'd say.
My last question for you, Josh, is what's your confidence level that your analysis is correct and that Democrats are going to end up being underestimated or in a strong position to win this election?
Yeah, well, I feel like I think we have a lot of evidence right now from the modeling that my friend, also Josh, did to like what we know these pollsters have done to, I think, maybe overcorrect or correct their mistakes, but there shouldn't be something significantly overestimating Trump. If that happens, it's for something we have no clue about right now and we'll only be able to know after the election. There's nothing we know about politics or polling right now that indicates like if that should be happening to a significant degree, unless like it's just a non-response thing again, like in which case polling really like is a little screwed.
Yeah, it's
but
dead.
What is kind of compelling to me is that we do have past precedent for this exact kind of thing happening, where pollsters get like really insecure and overclock in favor of the right, not in the U.S. but actually in the United Kingdom. In 2017, the election between Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May there, pollsters 2 years prior had incorrectly called a Labour win or a hung parliament when the Conservatives ended up winning a majority. 2 years later, they made a lot of changes to their polls, a lot of which were ad hoc changes, a lot like how pollsters are arguably making ad hoc changes now. Krystal, you mentioned that they were doing recall to vote, which is something that like can really only generously be called quite suspect. Like if applied, like Cohen showed that if applied to past elections over the past 20 years, it would have made all of the polling in all those years less accurate because people will tell you that they voted for people. Like people like saying that they voted for the winner.
Right.
So an accurate sample is going to usually get you people saying they voted more for the winner than for the loser. And by shifting that to the actual results, you're kind of just putting your thumb on the scale. British pollsters did a lot of that in 2017, and what ended up happening was that they ended up underestimating Labour. Every single forecaster at the end of the election called a conservative majority, so in some cases a very large conservative majority, and it only resulted in a hung parliament.
Yes.
The exception was YouGov, funnily enough. But so that is like a degree of like having that actual example that this is something that has happened before makes me feel like it's something that could happen. I won't like make any guarantees. I don't think anybody can, especially in a race that's this close. But the ingredients that were there in Britain in 2017 do seem to be here 7 years later.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Well, it is very interesting. And certainly if she ends up winning and outperforming the polls, I think a lot of people are going to look back at your analysis and say, you know, this guy had it right on. So guys, go subscribe to Edinger Mentum's Substack. And thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's great to have
Thanks
you.
for having
Thank
me
you, Josh.
on.
Yeah, it's our pleasure.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.